Hello, welcome to Pursuit of Perfect System. I hope you are all well, staying home and staying safe. Now, yesterday I posted an article on my website, the first one for a while, and it was discussing what is perfect bass. Now, I think if you asked 10 different audiophiles what is perfect bass to them, you would get 10 different answers and really 10 different opinions, which I think is absolutely fine. You know, to those audiophiles, I would say do whatever makes you happy, but I also think we can go one better than that. I think the answer to perfect bass, or at least from frequency point of view, has been out there in the public domain literally for decades. But can a system really deliver perfect bass, and can your room allow a system to deliver perfect bass? And again, that is what I look at in the article. And what I would suggest is, if you haven't read the article, I would say stop this video here and go and read the article first. I'll link it up there for you, because in this video what I don't want to do is just repeat what's in that article. What I want to do is use this video to support that article, or the other way around, whichever way you look at it. And in the video I want to discuss and look at some new and different things, because I just keep looking at this graph and I'm staring at it and I'm staring at it, and every time I stare at it I feel like I learned something new, or I take away from it something new in terms of how really I think this graph is telling us how an audio system should be set up and how it should deliver its sound. So what is it you are looking at here in the graph? Well, this is an ISO 226 2003 equal loudness curves. And ISO stands for International Standardization Organization, and they have taken data from different countries, and they've looked at studies that were done at different times since the 1930s, and they've collaborated and put together, a standardized set of data. But what does that data actually tell us, and what does it mean? Well, if you're looking at the graphs, you can see there's some wavy lines, but those graphs actually represent a human being's audible perception at equal volume. So as you move up the graphs, you'll see different curves. You've got increased or higher numbers of phon, and that phon represents an SPL level, so 0 phons, 20 phons, 40 phons, 80 phons, and maybe 100 phons, which is a fixed volume level, so 0 decibels, 20 decibels, 40 decibels, 80 decibels, 100 decibels. And then the curves that you can see are the scientifically proven equal loudness curves. So as you track those curves across the frequency, which is the x-axis along the bottom, you can see how much in SPL is needed for the y-axis, which is going along the left and up and down the left. So how much is needed in SPL for that frequency to be perceived at the same volume as the phon. So we'll just use the example of 80 phon, so 80 decibels as a volume. Look at how varied the frequency curve is for a human being to be able to hear each frequency at a perceived same volume as 80 decibels. So what do these graphs really mean, and why is it interesting? Why is it important? Why am I making a video about it? And why did I write an article about it? Well, when it comes to setting up an audio system from a frequency point of view, for years, and something you'll see written and spoken about all the time, is a flat sound or a flat frequency response, which gets confused for a flat sound, but it's really a sound that's neutral or a sound that is balanced. And what does that even mean? Well, if you fed a 1 watt signal into an audio system at different frequencies between 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz, what comes out of the speakers, more importantly, what hits your ears at the listening position, if that sound was totally balanced, it would be the exact same perceived volume regardless of the frequency. So for a completely balanced sound, the theory of a flat sound or a flat frequency response was the input signal going into the system would equal the exact same audible signal at the listening position. So a flat frequency response, a ruler flat frequency response. But anybody who's ever set up an audio system to have a flat frequency response will know it sounds bloody awful. And the reason it sounds bloody awful is because of this graph. Look at this graph. Again, we don't want a flat frequency response at all, because it doesn't sound flat. A flat frequency response sounds really very lean and really very forward, dry and analytical. What's really interesting is that these studies started back in the 1930s with Fletcher and Munson, move forward 40 years up to 2003, and all those years later, with all the different tests that have been done, the data that's been produced, even though it's not quite the same, it's very, very, very similar. So I think the data and what we're seeing here is extremely credible and something we do need or should be paying attention to as audiophiles. For purposes of this video, I just want to focus on the bass aspects of these equal loudness curves, and we'll leave the mid-range and treble to a future time because there's an area I'm still investigating and looking into. But from a bass point of view, I've been taking into account what these equal loudness curves tell us for about the last 10 years. But it's only really been recently since I've been out and done direct live calibrations for lots of different people. So I've basically measured lots of different speaker systems in lots of different rooms. And when you're analysing frequency response charts for hours and hours and hours a day, you start seeing trends and you start seeing very, very interesting things. And it's developed how I set up audio systems. So I must ask as a first question, would this frequency response from a pair of speakers actually sound good? And I must hold my hands up and say I've never heard a pair of speakers with a frequency response that exactly matches what we're seeing here on this equal loudness curve graph. And I'd like to invite anybody who has to come on here in the comment section and please give me as much detail as you can about the speakers, about how you measured their frequency responses, because I'd really like to know how this sounds, because the majority of the speaker systems that I've measured, some of them mimic what this graph shows us, but I've not seen any that completely follows this kind of smiley face curve. It's a bit like the Joker, isn't it? The Joker's smile, really, really interesting. So looking at the bass area from these equal loudness curves, what are the things that we can learn from it? Well, I think there's a hell of a lot to learn, as I mentioned. So looking at the shape of these curves, what you can instantly see is that as bass deepens in frequencies or lowers in frequency, we need exponentially more SPL of those bass notes to be perceived as an equal volume to bass notes higher up in the frequencies. Now this is something I've been mindful, as I say, for about the last 10 years. But when you actually start to look at the specific numbers, they're quite staggering. So if you had a home cinema system and you was listening to a movie at about 80 decibels, you would need about 120 decibels of 20 hertz bass for it to be perceived at the same volume as, say, a 500 hertz note. Now that's really quite interesting, because is it any wonder why, you know, audiophiles like big ass subwoofers, big 18-inch drivers, dual driver subwoofers, big stacks of subwoofers? Is it any wonder that those types of setups can be really, really pleasing to audiophiles? Well, it's not, is it, when you look at this data? So what about looking at something that's more realistic or more representative of music, of hi-fi music playback? Well, if we looked at 40 hertz, which to me seems like a pretty common roll-off point for a pair of speakers, and if we look at what's just above audible or just above the audible threshold for a balanced sound, at what you can just about hear, you still need 50 decibels worth of 40 hertz bass for there to be a balanced sound. But what you'll clearly see is the required decibels or SPL at 40 hertz very quickly rises. When we're up in the more average listening levels of music, maybe between 70 and 90 decibels, you need a hell of a lot of 40 hertz bass for the sound to be balanced, which again I think is really very interesting for quite a few reasons. And I think the first reason is it makes it more difficult to justify smaller speakers that are limited in their bass output. Now, before I upset anybody, clearly people have been using and listening to small speakers for decades and they've absolutely loved it. So it's not about me saying don't do that, it's about me saying this is giving us what is potentially perfect bass in terms of frequency. So it makes it more difficult to justify bass limited speakers. And I think this is also really important because there was a video created recently by Taryn, the British audiophile, called Speaker Myths or something like that. It's been a really popular video for him, and in that he talks about bass problems in rooms, and one way to get around a bass problem is to use a small speaker, i.e. limit the bass output that goes into the room. Well, which is fine. That's totally fine advice. But when you look at how much bass is needed to create a balanced sound, surely having not enough bass is just the same problem as having too much bass. I would actually argue not having enough bass is a worse problem, because it's much easier to manage too much bass down than it is to manage not enough bass up. Managing not enough bass up is extremely difficult, and even the inclusion or the addition of subwoofers, yes, that will definitely increase the amount of bass that you will have in a system, but you then need to think about integration, you then need to think about timing, you then need to think about a different set of placements. There's a whole load of setup considerations when adding a subwoofer to a pair of speakers. Again, not putting off anybody doing that, it's a fantastic way to go, it's just something else to consider. But I can hear some of you saying, Terry, I only listen at lower volumes. I don't need lots of bass to listen at lower volumes. Well, if you look at these equal loudness curves, you can see the lower in volume that you listen, actually the more bass that you need in SPL to create a balanced sound. And this is really, really very interesting. And I'm sure lots of you would have had a situation where a system doesn't sound quite dynamic enough with a lower volume, turn the volume up, and that system sounds more dynamic. Well, you can see from these equal loudness curves what the cause of that might be. Not enough treble and not enough bass. Again, we're focusing on the bass aspect for this video. So I think from this, we could see why certain audiophiles that listen at quieter volumes might prefer certain types of speakers that are maybe bassier and more trebly in their presentation, because they might actually be a more balanced sound at lower volumes. Again, this might make a big impact to you for the next speakers that you buy. Again, how interesting is this? Think how much we can actually learn from just looking at this one chart or this one set of graphs. And then you have to factor in something that's hugely important with frequency responses in rooms, and that is speaker placement. Now, there's loads of videos and loads of advice from audiophiles that say pull your speakers out from the wall, pull your speakers out into the middle of the room, you know, get the speakers away from boundaries and reflections. And there's nothing wrong with that advice for those particular reasons, but something nobody ever mentions is the effect of pulling a speaker away from a boundary and how that affects a speaker's bass response. It's never ever mentioned, which means I don't think anybody's paying attention to it, which is, as we can see on from this graph, mistake number one, because lots of speakers can be big in output and big in their bass output, but to hit these sorts of numbers, to try and achieve this type of frequency response, I would assume that most speakers are going to need quite a bit of boundary or room gain. Now, to explain boundary gain or room gain, that is where you place a speaker near a boundary of the room, and really that boundary boosts or amplifies the low end from the speaker. So it's essentially like getting free bass or free amplification from the room. Now, before you panic, whenever you put a pair of speakers in a room, that room is an amplifier to the frequency response of those speakers, and it's not a linear one. It will kink it up and down all over the place. Now, that is just one of the things about listening to speakers in rooms, but the free bass or the free sound that we can get, the positive construction, I think it's called, i.e. the more bass that we can get from boundary gain or speaker boundary interaction, can be of huge benefit to trying to achieve this bass curve from a pair of speakers. So when you start thinking, well, I need to pull my speakers away from a boundary, I need to get them out into the middle of the room, be mindful of how that will affect their bass response. I would definitely be mindful of how that will affect their bass response when you start stuffing ports, when you start stuffing pairs of socks into ports. I always feel like that's counterintuitive and definitely not the best way forward. Another thing to consider is that, as you can see from the various different graphs on this chart, and obviously this is only plotting at certain volumes to make it easier to read, but you can see that the target that we're looking at here, it is a moving target. So if you listen at 40 decibels, the curve is different to if you listen at 100 decibels. So that's really very interesting, and it probably is why you would need to set this type of curve up specific to you, for your specific listening volume in your specific room. And it's probably why manufacturers of speakers don't produce speakers that mimic this curve, because they can't, can they? How can they? They can't do it for every single room, for every single volume. It's just not possible. So the fact that it's a moving target is something we definitely need to be mindful of. But at the same time, if you look at those curves, the shape of them is very, very similar, especially once we get above probably 40 or 50 decibels as an average listening level or a phon, because I don't think 40 or 50 decibels is very loud. I think 40 decibels is about just average kind of ambient volume within a room. So most people listen to their hi-fi, I assume, quite a bit louder than that. But what's interesting, what we can take from that, is that if we have our system, or if we have our speakers set up to deliver this shape of frequency response for the bass at our listening position, as we raise the volume up or as we lower the volume down, yes, it's not going to be absolutely perfect for those other volumes, but the general shape is going to be correct. It's going to be right. It's going to be balanced. So when you do listen at quieter volumes later at night, or when you listen at party levels during the day, the system is going to stay mostly balanced for most of the time. So that's got to be a positive way forward, isn't it? It's got to be a sensible way to go. Now, I'm sure there's loads more things that you guys are seeing from these equal loudness curves that I haven't mentioned in this video, and maybe that I haven't seen. And if you have seen anything that I've missed, or if I've misinterpreted the data, please tell me below in the comment section. I'm sure some of you will be all over that. But I want to put an interjection in right here, because before all of you rush out and start buying Serwin Vega Bass Monster speakers, obviously there are a hell of a lot of caveats and pitfalls and challenges and obstacles to try and achieve this exact bass response in your room. And those challenges go even higher or even greater when that room's a domestic room and you're not able to do exactly what you need to achieve these curves. And obviously the problems you're going to have are, well, there are many. Trying to achieve this frequency response means feeding lots more bass, or lots of bass, into your listening room. The more bass you feed into a listening room, and the more bass you feed into a listening room at lower frequencies, aka much bigger wavelengths, much bigger sound waves, the bigger problems you have from bass, such as ringing, such as modes, such as kind of pressure and standing wave builds up of bass within that room. So you can actually make the problem worse for making it better, which is why I'm sure Taryn, the British audiophile, suggests smaller speakers with less bass output don't make the bass problem worse, because there is nothing worse than boomy bass. But for me, there's also nothing worse than not having enough bass. A system that always sounds lean will always sound analytical, dry and shouty. There's just nothing you can really do about that, and it gets worse the more you turn it up. So we need to be mindful that we need to get as much bass in as we can to get as much of a balanced sound as we can. So two methods to go about fixing this is obviously acoustic treatments. Put bass absorption in the room, which will definitely help to reduce reverb, reduce ringing, to reduce bass decay times, to tighten that whole bass up. Getting down into the 30 and 20 hertz bass notes, it's really, really difficult to have acoustic treatment that works at those frequencies. But above that, products from GRK Acoustics, I use them and they are fantastic, and they definitely help with bass ringing within a room. But to get an exacting frequency response like what is in these curves, to me, the only real way to achieve that, on top of using acoustic treatment, I'll definitely do acoustic treatment first, is then using DSP and solutions like Direct Live, which are really easy to use and give a user complete control over the sound that they get. So you are able to set bass target curves up to within pretty good reasons. So that would be the only way I can see to achieve this type of linear, really tight shaped bass response in a room. The last thing an analog audiophile is going to want to do is go over to using digital solutions. But if we want to achieve a balanced sound, if we want to achieve a totally neutral sound, which has got to be the theory of analog audio files in the first place. You have to keep that sound pure. If what comes out of the speakers and hits you at the listening position isn't balanced, then it doesn't matter how balanced the sound is coming through the analog system, you're not hearing it balanced. And if you don't hear a sound that's balanced, you're messing with tone, you're messing with tonality, you're messing with, you know, imaging placement, you're messing with so much of that original signal, because ultimately the frequency response that you hear from a pair of speakers at the listening position, that is dictating what you are and are not hearing. It doesn't dictate sound quality, but it does dictate what you do and don't hear. So it's really, really, really interesting, really important. I think that's why I could just keep staring at these graphs thinking, right, you know, what can I learn from these? What is there to gain? What is there to learn? So as I mentioned, I've been putting into place some of what this graph shows me for about a decade, and currently my KEF reference free speakers are set up to deliver pretty much this type of bass response in my listening room to about 40 hertz. They run out of puff at 40 hertz. But it's very, very, very interesting. And I actually started to put more of this into place at the back end of last year. So the couple of the most recent demonstrations that you would have seen from my review room, my main system with the KEF reference free speakers, is taking more of this bass into account. So if you'd like to see one coming soon, which should be a pretty interesting and special one, I'll be producing a demonstration video as part of the review for the Griffin Diablo 300 integrated amplifier, the new JCAT XE USB card. I'm waiting for the new JCAT Optimo 3 linear power supply before I do this, because I want to feed that Griffin with the best possible signal I can, and also the Tungsten Grooves W70 isolation feet. That's me pushing my review system up there probably as far as it's ever been before, and it's going to be a really, really interesting demonstration. So if you want to hear what this type of bass curve actually sounds like, how, I suppose, how harmonically rich and how dynamic and how expressive bass can be, drums, other bass notes can be, there'll be one coming soon. So maybe that'll inspire you again to take on this and really pay attention to what this graph is teaching us. You know, I'll finish on these thoughts. Very recently I've been and heard and experienced a line array of real subwoofers, 6 subwoofers, and I've experienced them now on, I think, 2 or 3 different occasions. And think about how much bass 6 subwoofers can put out, and then you look at how much bass we actually need for this equal loudness curve, and it starts to make you think, there's something in there, isn't there? There's definitely something in that. And I've been thinking that already, which is why I'm here anyway. It's why I'm looking at these curves to start with. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Lots more coming soon. Take care, stay safe, wash your hands. All the best. Bye-bye.